Well, it's great to be here. I think it's really brilliant that the United Methodist Church has kind of pulled together this task force, because I don't see many people making the links. I think people often work on one issue, or they work on things, but they don't necessarily connect things that need to be connected together. So looking at militarism, people don't always think about climate change, or people who work on incarceration don't necessarily look at kind of corporations and the role of corporations.
Just for the benefit of the live stream, would you please reintroduce yourself, because we just got on.
So I'm Nick Buxton. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. But I just think it's really good that there's this. I haven't seen many of this where people try to actually link all these things together, and I think it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this work. So my name's Nick. I grew up in Britain, as you can hear from my accent. Someone asked me how I ended up here. It was love. I fell in love with a Californian who brought me here. I'm just starting to apply for my citizenship, so I can make sure I can vote in next elections, because this country needs some help. And the reason why I'm not an expert on many of these issues, but so I want to just kind of talk to where I have some expertise and some big picture things that come out of that analysis, and hopefully that will just be one part of the threads, of the many threads you will feed into your work. But I think it is crucial, I think the focus on prison and detention and incarceration is a really key one. And we know in the US, it's 5% of the world's population, but you have 25% of the prisoners. And and of course, 60% of people are people of colour. So the issue of racism is kind of embedded in that very system. And detention is as well. It's really a booming industry. I just looked at the statistics this week. It's 52,000 people are currently being detained across the US. And my background is I've been involved in lots of peace and social justice movements, and I think that's I found myself bringing those two things together. I was particularly, just out of university, very much involved in the protests against the Iraq War. I lived in Bolivia for 4 years prior to coming to California, and that's really where I started to witness climate change firsthand. I lived in this capital city, and it's surrounded by these beautiful mountains, but the mountain glaciers are disappearing. So one of the glaciers right above it is where they had one of the highest ski slopes in the world, and now it's vanished completely. And that provides about 20% of the water for that city. And then, of course, I was here in Davis last year when we had the Paradise Fires, and seeing how that impacted on people, with people not being able to breathe. It affects certain people more than others, and you could really sort of see people who are elderly or people who have asthma. These kind of things are hitting home right where we are right now. And of course, it varies. In Davis, we're a pretty largely white privileged city. Talking to, is it Joanna? And at the back about Richmond, there's people who face this every day by living in refinement. So our experiences of these things are very different, but hit home at certain people very strongly. And then more recently, in the last 10 years, I've been working with Transnational Institute, which is a global institute that works with social movements in different countries, like Patricia was saying. So working particularly with farmers' movements in Latin America, working with different kind of peace movements in different parts of the world, and lots of people working on whether it's trade policy or corporate power, and people fighting corporate impunity. They cover a lot of ground, and that sometimes it's like too much, but other times it connects things which I don't think are connected. So I wanted to just to kind of give a broad brush about what I thought, what I kind of call about this time, and from some of the areas of work, and I particularly worked on this book, which was looking at military and corporate strategies for responding to climate change. and so some of this draws on, particularly on that book. But what I call a kind of catastrophic convergence, which is what I see right now. And it's the influence of a few kind of key trends that I think are going to be critical context for some of your work. The first one is we've had several decades now of what many people call neoliberal politics, neoliberal policies, where there's been an ethos of cutting spending, social spending, of privatizing services which were previously held publicly, of deregulating markets, whether it was the finance and the banks, whether the deregulation that went on in that sector, and lowering taxes on the highest income, on the highest incomes. And that has led to, I think, firstly, the most obvious is the kind of massive inequality that we're witnessing, not just here in the US, but also globally. The statistic I pulled out yesterday was that we talked about the Occupy movement used that 1% and the 99%. Really, it's the 0.1%. Because 0.1% of the population of Americans take in 188 times what the bottom 90%, the largest people, earn. So we've got this huge wealth gap inequality opening up. Globally, very much the same figures are coming. Oxfam does this annual report you've probably seen. The last year it was that 26 people, just 26 people, that's just slightly larger than this room, own the same wealth as half the world's population. So as well as that kind of inequality, I think what's more pernicious is some of the ideas behind it, which was very much the ideology that accompanies it, which is a very individualist thing where success is predicated on the idea is that it's just your merits and what you can do, what you can achieve is what matters, and it ignores whole systems that very much shape people's choices. And it ignores the importance of the community, which is where really values and efforts are really built. I have a friend from Zimbabwe, and he says this individualist thing makes no sense. We talk about Ubuntu, I am because we are. We've lost that ethic within the US, and that's led to a lot of, I think we can see some of the results now, it's led to a deeply weakened social fabric in this country, a lot of alienation, and it's led to the likes of people like Trump who arrive and promise of a kind of authoritarian response to what is a social crisis. And alongside this, so that's the first one I put, is this neoliberal policies. Then the second trend I see very much emerging is that corporate capture of politics. And we all know that corporations have become more dominant and powerful, but we don't necessarily know the extent of it. It's been won on many fronts. Judicially, there have been more and more decisions which have given more and more rights to corporations. The most famous one of which was the Citizens United, where corporations are treated as people who can spend as much money on elections as they want. But it's also happened economically. Greece, when it had a whole huge social crisis, was held hostage, in effect, by the banks, who said you have to pay your debt, because if you don't, then we will collapse your economy. And in the end, the government that came to power, which was quite a progressive government, had no choice. They either faced a complete collapse, or they had to go along with exactly what the banks were asking. And then politically, we see it really with the whole influence in lobbying campaigns and contributions. And I think you can kind of see there was a study done by, I think, some Harvard professors who looked at, over 20 years, they looked at 1,800 policies. And they said, government policies, said, whose interests do they serve? And they nearly always serve the rich or the upper middle class, and very rarely do they serve the poorest of American society. So this influence within politics is very much shaping the policies that emerge. And then the third element I put with this catastrophic convergence, and I think this is where the theme comes in today, is around the rise of what I call a military and a homeland security state. So on one side you have a huge rise in military spending. I grew up around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was a real hope that we would have more peace, that money would be invested in social spending. But since 1990, the world military spending has actually doubled. It's gone from just under $1 trillion to $1.8 trillion last year. And at the same time, there's been what is a militarization of within the country. So this trend of militarization has kind of expanded. So particularly since 9/11, there's a massive expansion of the Department of Homeland Security. So a lot of money went into a whole range of agencies, one of which is the border agencies, which I'll talk about a bit more. But also a whole bunch of intelligence agencies, but also the increasing militarization of different parts of society. So you suddenly had police forces, and there's a picture that came up earlier. Police forces are being given military surplus gear to actually police streets. And that was taken out into Ferguson after the protests. You had, after the killings in Ferguson, then you had these huge tanks were the ones that were being deployed to respond to protests, or in Standing Rock. So you have this increasing militarization. I heard some people say it from Alameda, and I think that's where the Urban Shield Expo in Alameda County has been. And so you've got this pop-up of huge expos where a lot of military people are coming to police forces saying, we can provide you with all these things, whether it's drones, whether it's armored tanks, and this kind of general militarization of society. And of course it's played out in a different way within the incarceration system. We're responding to complex social problems increasingly with security solutions as the kind of default solution. So I think this is the three kind of trends I see feeding into each other: the neoliberal policies, the corporate capture of policy, and the rise of the military and security response. And that's happening not just in the US, it's happening in Britain, it's happening in countries like Honduras or Brazil right now. But the consequences have led to a lot of things that we're witnessing and can feel in our bones right now. A democratic crisis, the rise of leaders like Trump, or Bolsonaro, Duterte, who offer kind of very simplistic authoritarian responses. We have a social crisis, because what happens as you start to bring these forces to bear, entrenches racial, gender, and geographic inequalities that already exist. And we're also having increasing people on the move right now as conflict feeds these crises. And what's now happening increasingly is it's being intensified by a climate crisis. And so there's a lot of migration, for example, in places like Honduras and Guatemala, where there's been a kind of an underlying, has some of the military roots of it. So, for example, the funding that happened in Central America right back to the 80s of various guerrilla groups, and the US's involvement in that has fed a whole cycle of violence, which is now being added to by a climate crisis. So a lot of people are leaving because they talk about gangs and increased violence in society, but they're also leaving because of drought. And so these mixture of factors are kind of coming up, and they're leading more people to migrating. And one of the trouble is that one of the kind of dominant responses to that is, where corporations and the military have had a role, is to then look to the corporations and military to respond. And this is very much what informed this book, because what we saw was a lot of corporate and military plans were looking long term and saying, we're going to have crisis, we need security solutions, and this is what the military is going to do to respond to it, and this is what the corporations are going to do to respond to it. And it's led to what I call as kind of a politics of security, which is really become, because the language of security has become the dominant language of our time right now. So this catastrophic convergence of influences leading to a politics of security, and we see that everywhere. Trump is the obvious example of that. A few days won't go past without him talking about the security of our borders, and today it was the kind of his latest ideas of how to make the fence even with moats and spikes and make it even more military than it is. But we see it in lots of other areas. I do a lot on European Union policy, and they've got a very similar strategy for security, which is all about securing Europe. You see it in corporate plans. And we hear it constantly. People talk about food security, water security, energy security. Security has become the language. And the question, I think, whenever you hear that word security, I suggest an alarm should go off in your head. Because I think the key question then to ask is security for who? It's a weasel word, because some of us, the trouble is that we use it in very different contexts, but it then gets manipulated and used in the same. So I think if you ask someone what would make you feel more secure, a job, a house, a neighborhood of people I know and trust. So we have but then the same word is used to talk about some of the militarization of the border that's going on. Where we go abroad, where the US sends forces abroad to defend the US. And that's called security as well. So all these things are dovetailed together. And I think what's important for me to understand about security is normally about securing what already exists. And if you live in a very unjust world, that will mean securing those who have wealth and power and resources. And often that very act of security will make other people more insecure. And that's what we can really very much see with the wall and the militarization of the US border right now. The whole thing has been talked about on this idea of security. Whereas we know, well, whose security are we talking about? If you talk to most people who live on the border, they've had a long relationship of back and forth relationships across many communities were crossed by the border. If you're a Native American, they say that we didn't cross the border crossed us. They used to be on their land territories were never covered both sides of the border. So we're not talking, so the security is not about the local communities. And when we looked at it in terms of the US, we did a report very recently called More Than the War. We looked at it and we've seen that over the last 20 years, there's been a massive boom in contracts. There have been, since 2006, 64,000 contracts have been given to corporations to secure the border, within $27 billion of money, which has turned, and it's not just the war. What we don't often understand is that there was a decision in 1957 that said that the border can include anywhere 100 miles from the actual physical border. So, and in that area, various parts of the Constitution can be suspended because it's considered frontier and border politics. So instead, and actually that 100 miles, if you take a line with 100 miles, that includes 2/3 of the US population, where various parts of the Constitution are suspended because it's considered the border. And what you've said is an increasing cycle of increasing levels of militarization and technology. So it started in the 90s with helicopters, then they had a whole series of radars and sensors, and this relates to Israel and Palestine. Elbit came and built a whole, about 50 towers, and they sell themselves as saying they're battle-proofed. We've done this in Gaza, we can do this in the US as well. So they sell their technology. So this is an Israeli firm selling its expertise in the walls of Gaza to sell technology to control the US border. And it's a kind of never-stopping cycle. And I have a friend who wrote the report, and he goes to these border security expos where there is a whole, constantly corporations, and they meet with all the government officials and the ones who make the contracts, and they say, okay, you've got helicopters, what you really need is drones now. And now they're offering their things is, okay, we need mobile surveillance units. Then we need robots. Then we need robots that can incapacitate people across the border. So you create this kind of ratcheting up of militarization. And many of the officials kind of run between, because of corporate capture, it runs between the two systems. So 3 out of the 4 most recent commissioners for the Customs and Border Patrol, 4 of them then went on to work for exactly the security firms that win the contract. So there's this revolving door of power. But also just a familiarity. They're used to now just speak in the same language. They go to the same expos together. They have a pre-golf day before these expos where they can all meet, and then they form a kind of policy which feeds the cycle of money, more militarization, more policy that justifies the money, and so on. And of course, Trump has kind of put that in everyone's spotlight, but this is a process that's been going on for for more than 20 years. And it comes back to the question again, is who's been secure? Well, certainly the profit line for various corporations has been secured. But it does nothing for the security of people, because what they're showing is that the militarization of border forces people to take more and more dangerous routes to try and avoid those very systems. And you can never get a completely secure system. So a lot of people now are crossing through the most, where they don't have the border things, where they can't put all these things in because they're very remote in mountains or desert regions. And we know that since 1998, when money policies happened, that even the Customs and Border Patrol's own statistics say that 7,500 people have died just crossing the border. People who live on the border, including many church groups who do a lot of humanitarian groups, say it's way more than that because they keep coming across skeletons in the desert. You may have heard about this case recently where this group who were even going out to give the water to drops are being are now being accused of trafficking trafficking refugees. So I kind of I want to kind of end there. I think what I want to end with is really why I think it's important that the church speaks out on these issues. I'm a member of the Episcopalian Church in Davis, and I was saying to Jim, I grew up in. My dad is a chaplain at the university. He used to, because there was no children's program, he'd send me to the Methodist church to get Sunday school training. So I don't know anything about the structure, so Jim was trying to explain conferences and all that. I didn't get that, but I do know what a Methodist service is like. You don't want to know. And I think, certainly as a Christian myself, I think Jesus called us to a very different set of values and principles than the politics of security. Because in the sense that politics of security is securing privilege and wealth and power to those who already have it is completely the opposite message of the gospel. In a sense, I would say Jesus completely turned that idea of security on its head. And constantly, whether it's talking about the first should be last, or the impossibility of the rich man entering the kingdom of God, and his constant condemnation of people just relying on the systems that they have and saying, whether it's how much they would be willing to give and so on. So there's a whole a different, I would say, more politics of radical love, which is completely opposed to politics of today's politics of security. And I think it's evident that right now that we're in a time of systemic crisis, and I think particularly as these elements come together and feed into what will be the climate crisis, we're going to see more and more of these injustices entrenched unless we say that we need a different response. And in a sense, what I think Trump's response to the border should be teaching us is that is the kind of world we could live more and more in if we don't start changing it, because more people are going to be on the moon, more people are going to be and if we respond to that with the idea that we just have to militarize further and further, put more spikes on the fence, create more moats, then we're going to create a world that no one wants to live in, and certainly not a world completely opposed to the values of the gospel. And I think I just want to end with and I think we have these choices right now to say we have this social crisis. We can see what are the causes of that, some of the underlying trends. And we can't allow the same institutions that caused the crisis to be the ones who are leading the response. So we need a different approach and a different response in this time of crisis. And I think the story I often come back to is the one around Katrina, where you, in a sense, saw those two world possibilities at the same time. Because Katrina, as the floods moved back, it not only showed the crisis of the city, but it showed the deep inequalities, particularly racial inequalities there, because the people who couldn't move and were stuck with the floods were often the poorest, were often black, people of colour. And then you had a response, which was a very militarised response. So the National Guard was sent in, people who were just trying to get food to survive were treated as looters, and a very, very slow response. This is the time of the Iraq War where we could send millions of troops across, but we couldn't within a few days respond adequately, and when we did, it was a very militarized response to different people. But the other story that often isn't captured is that those communities that were left behind did incredible acts of solidarity and cooperation. They responded to the crisis not by saying this is all about me. They're saying we have to look for it. People who were on the streets were saying we have to go and get the person down the street who's elderly. We have to make sure she's okay. We want to get her back to keep her safe. They were looking out. They knew who was vulnerable and they knew who they needed to support. And communities all came together. They started kind of finding out who needed help. Then they started cooperating. And often, and that response, and then you had a whole response also from citizens, of people who went out, just had fishing boats. They went out and responded, sometimes faster than the government did at that time. And so we have this response, and there's this human capacity to respond to crises with real acts of compassion and collaboration and solidarity. But we're going to have to really kind of push and fight for that and put those models down. And Alameda's an example of that. They had this urban shield, which was very much a kind of militarized response. There's now, from my understanding earlier this year, this county there is saying, rather than looking for militarized responses to disasters, how can we build community-based responses to disasters? And there's been some really interesting initiatives. So they're saying, actually, this isn't the approach we want. We want an approach which is actually based on what citizens can do together, which is a civilian-based response. And so there are models that we can build, and I hope that can be also part of